All right, here's a little lunchtime tech talk, y'all, from Genius on what is a blockchain. Now, a blockchain is what Bitcoin is based on, and it is governed by these principles. It is an unforgeable, completely public ledger of all something, let's call it X, in existence, in its transaction history back to the very beginning. All right, a few things in there to unpack. The first is the concept of a ledger. Everything else is kind of just window dressing. A ledger is a list, like in accounting, of all transactions. So when I spend a $10 bill or a $1 bill, let's think of a $1 bill which everyone who has spent it has written their name on it. That is a little ledger accounting for the movement of that dollar through different transactions. So a ledger is a list of transactions. A blockchain is an unforgeable list of transactions. Why is that important that it's unforgeable? We just don't want anybody representing that they have $1 million, million Bitcoin, million Ether account balance, unless they truly have a claim to that. So this public ledger is unforgeable. And it's completely public in the sense that any balance can be seen and verified. You just don't know necessarily who owns that account, but the balance of every account and the entire transaction history, the froms and the tos, which we'll explain in the contents of a block very shortly, are all going to be public. And that's important because it allows any old machine in the network to verify transactions and accept payments. So a machine in the network of a blockchain is called a node. So it's a Bitcoin node, or more generally speaking, a blockchain node. A node is a machine in a network which runs the software that implements the blockchain's protocols and network sharing semantics. So the node is the one with the responsibility for making sure that we are unforgeable, completely public, and that we encode somehow all transactions all the way to the beginning of time. Now that might sound like a lot of data, but there are some things that are done to basically make there be the complete history of the data and a lightweight history of the data. And so to understand what data is on the blockchain, we're going to have to look at a single block. So let's go to a single block here. Now, a single block has a few components of which we want to speak. And we'll trace back each component to the properties of the blockchain that implement it. Now, being completely public means that anybody can request this block, which we're indicating is 44,235. We're just putting a number on every block. Anybody can ask for this block, and if we all ask for that block, we'll all get the same thing. So it's completely public to see what this block or the previous block or all 44,000 blocks. There's some number of gigabytes that this encompasses for all of Bitcoin transactions. It's not a lot at this point compared to what a normal computer can handle, but you can expect that it'll be growing exponentially as there's more transactions. So we have a block. Let's study a single block. It has a sequence number, but more important than the sequence number is some long string of digits that is kind of like a checksum. It's called a hash. So our first two components are the block number and the block hash. Now, the block hash will be explained in a little bit. It's kind of what accounts for the unforgeable property, because every single piece of this block, if you change even a single digit anywhere in the block, including the hash, then someone who gets this block, when they try to hash it, or compute the checksum of it, it will not be this number. In fact, at any change, it'll be radically different. You won't even be close. So this is what gives it the unforgeable property, is that every piece of information is accounted for in this hash, and any change will break the hash. One of the jobs of a Bitcoin node is to receive a block like this, compute the hash of the entire block, and make sure that it is exactly what's in the block. So that's how you know that what you're getting is completely valid. Now, so if we are on block 44,235, one of the components of this block is going to be a link to the previous block. And you notice that not only do we have the number of the previous block, but we actually have the hash of the previous block. So in this sense, you can say that the blockchain consists of individual blocks that point to the previous block. And because this hash accounts for the entire contents of the previous block, if I have any reason to doubt that this hash is correct, I can request the previous block and hash it, and if I don't get that exact number, then I know that while this block may not have an error in it, something previous in the history has an error. What makes blockchains possible that really wasn't possible in computing 20 years ago is just the speed at which we take for granted that we can move this much data back and forth across the network and then do the hashing in time to process 40, 50, 100,000 blocks to be sure that a brand new transaction that's getting added to a new block is actually valid and based on the exact same history that everyone everywhere else in the world has. So we have the block number, the block hash, the previous block number and the previous block hash, and then a list of transactions. I would actually say that the columns of that we keep track of in a transaction, it's a little complicated. I'm doing an oversimplification here, but we're including from and to destinations. So each entry in this ledger indicates a movement of money from a place called an input to a place called an output in the following amount of whatever. If it's the Bitcoin blockchain, then this is an amount expressed in terms of Bitcoins. Whichever blockchain, it's an amount moved from an input to an output, or multiple inputs to multiple outputs, and then a signature verifying the authenticity of this transaction. And that's a little bit much to explain right now, how transactions get signed, but transactions also have IDs and signatures similar to blocks. So there's a kind of fractal, nested relationship that is prevalent in blockchain. It actually makes it very comprehensible once you get off the ground with some of these concepts, like hashing. Okay, so now we've talked about what a node is. Its job is to take in blocks, verify them, and then take in new transactions. So how do transactions get added to blocks? Well, a machine called a miner, and every node on the Bitcoin or blockchain network does not have to be a miner, but it's necessary that there are at least several miners on the network. Each one of them is the recipient of a transaction. So if we have a network of nodes that is not hub and spoke, but kind of decentralized, a little graphy, if you will, and then a new transaction originates over here, and if these are all your miners, that new transaction goes out to every miner, and every miner says, I am going to create a block with that transaction in it. And I'm just going to wait until I get enough transactions to fill a block. Okay, so that number depends on which blockchain we're talking about, but there's some idea that you have to wait long enough to put a bunch of these into a block. When you get a bunch of transactions that are ready to go in a block, when you've filled up the number of transactions you can hold, what you'll attempt to do is, along with the transaction data, you'll attempt to create a hash that includes the previous block number, this block number, and the previous block hash. You'll attempt to create a hash for this block. Now, normally, creating a hash is very easy. It can be done very quickly. It's just, some operation on this data. It just folds it on itself, and it's like mixing cream into a cup of coffee. It just, takes the bits and swirls them about, and you end up with a hash. But you notice something about this hash is that the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 digits of the hash are all zeros. That's very strange. That doesn't happen just by accident. Any random block that you have is not likely to have this many zeros in its hash. So what's going on? Well, what's going on is that hashes can take on any number of values, and it's very hard to predict for a given block what hash is going to look like. So if I want to arrive at the hash that is identical to this hash, except it differs only by this 3 being a 4, it's very hard to know what to change in this block to get that to happen, okay? So hashing really produces something that feels almost totally random from your input text. So this one place in the block that we've avoided is exactly the key to getting a hash that has an arbitrary number of zeros in the beginning. And that is, you, the miner, can add whatever random bits and bytes, or hexadecimal, random gibberish, just zeros and ones in whatever form you want, and you just keep trying to do that, until the first n places of the transaction hash are all 0. Now I say n because it really depends on which block number. You see, earlier blocks you only had to have a few zeros, and then higher blocks you need to have more zeros, and that's something called the difficulty level, adjusting over time. But in this case, if we need to get this many zeros, what a miner has to do to create a block that everyone will validate as valid is create different random gibberishes and keep trying them until as many zeros are in the hash as the difficulty level for that block requires. So it could be that from blocks 40,000 to 50,000, we need 8 zeros, and so any miner will be able to look at the random hex and all of the other data and do a hash, and it better get 8 zeros, or it rejects this block and says, this is not something I can add to the history. So we're talking about the function of each of these machines is to attempt to have that aha moment of, this is it, this is the random string to make the block valid. So now imagine that this guy over here gets it. It's like, hey, I got it. He does something pretty sneaky, and it's actually entirely allowed by the protocol, but he adds a single additional transaction. In fact, this transaction is in there from the beginning while he's computing these hashes, and this is a transaction that gives himself or herself, the miner, gives themselves some free Bitcoin. And as long as you create that hash with the right number of digits, and it's not easy to do, it takes a lot of electricity and spinning the computer's wheels to do it, but when you do get it, your account will get money. And then you'll tell everyone else in the network about your successful result and assert that that money that you just mined is yours. And as long as they take this in and compute the hash, and it says that that is indeed meeting the difficulty level of this block, then you know that that money can be counted on to be yours to be spent. Eventually, more blocks, such as 44,236, 37, 38, will be built incorporating this data. And the more blocks build on top of this data, the more certain you can be that this is not going to ever go away as part of the historical blockchain. So, in summary, the blockchain is a set of records called blocks containing transactions which have cryptographical properties that make them unforgeable, that make the entire history unforgeable, that keep track of all anything's in existence for that blockchain, Bitcoin or Ether, and it create a completely public accounting of all the movements of money, so that if somebody is attempting to send a transaction to you from an account, also called an address, that has a balance, you can request this whole blockchain and very quickly verify that that account has the money, and therefore you will hand over the t-shirt or whatever it is you're selling. Or if you're just an exchange, you're not handing over a physical good, you're just trading one currency to another. So in summary, that's a blockchain. I hope you enjoyed this little random walk, and look for more interesting crypto information from Denius in the near future. Peace.